She was 76, small, black, silently walked into court in handcuffs, just another old lady to them. But what no one knew was that she wasn't the one on trial. They were. And by the time they realized who she really was, it was already too late. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The moment Eunice Delacroix stepped into the courtroom, the air changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of shift you only feel if you've ever watched a room exhale too quickly, the hush that follows after a slap no one saw coming. She was 76, black, small-framed. Her spine had long surrendered to time, her eyes did not. They were sharp, quietly observant. She wore a faded blue dress, like something passed down through generations, and she walked with the slow precision of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to reveal. But no one in Chain Lake County Courtroom 2B saw her that way. They saw an old black woman in handcuffs. The bailiff barely made eye contact. The court clerk didn't look up. And Officer Jarrett, tall, pale, smug, leaned against the witness bench and whispered to his partner, "She looks like someone's grandmother lost her way to bingo night." They chuckled, unaware that history has a habit of watching men like them. Eunice said nothing. She hadn't said a word since her arrest. That silence unsettled them more than if she'd screamed. Judge Milford Tate, in his 14th year, on the bench, barely glanced over his glasses. He flipped through her case file with the detached rhythm of a man who'd signed too many warrants and remembered too few faces. He squinted. "Miss Della. Cricks, is that right?" She didn't flinch, didn't correct him. Tate raised an eyebrow. "You're not taking the court-appointed attorney?" Eunice lifted her chin slowly, deliberately. "No, Your Honor," she said, voice calm as morning rain. "I'll represent myself." A snort broke the silence. Laughter. Murmurs. A few eyes rolled in the gallery, mostly white, mostly locals. One woman whispered to her friend, "She's senile. Probably thinks this is church." Behind them, journalist Marcus Bell, one of the few black faces in the room, sat straighter. He had come from Detroit to cover corruption cases in rural courts. He wasn't expecting fireworks, but something about Eunice's stillness, her self-possession, pulled him in. She wasn't scared. She wasn't confused. She was waiting. The charges against her were plain on paper: obstruction of a peace officer, failure to disperse disorderly conduct. Marcus had seen a dozen cases like it. A routine sweep. An officer offended by quiet resistance. Then the prosecution played the body cam footage. It began with Officer Jarrett approaching Eunice on the sidewalk outside Chain Lake's public bus terminal. The camera angle bobbed as he walked toward her. She was standing still, tote bag in hand. Alone. No sound. He gestured at her, said something. She didn't move. The footage cut, then came back with sound. "Put your hands behind your back." Jarrett's voice barked through the courtroom's speakers. Still, she didn't react. She turned her head slightly, like she'd heard a bird, not a badge. The video stopped. Lacey Burrell, the county prosecutor, folded her arms confidently. "As you can see," she said, "the defendant was non-compliant." Officers were forced to act swiftly for public safety. That's when Eunice finally spoke. "Your Honor," she said, not turning toward the judge. "May I ask a question?" Tate looked annoyed. "This is not the time. Why was the audio missing from the first part of the video?" A beat of silence. Burrell blinked. "Technical glitch," she replied quickly. "Common with body cams." Eunice nodded. "Then I respectfully request the original file, with its metadata and full audio stream." Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. Burrell hesitated. Marcus Bell's pen stopped moving. No one expected this. The old woman in handcuffs had just asked for something most defendants in Chain Lake didn't even know existed. Not a plea deal, not mercy. Evidence. Real evidence. Judge Tate shifted in his seat. "We'll address that during evidentiary review," he said stiffly. But the damage had been done. The air in the room changed again, this time colder. Officer Jarrett glanced toward the screen, then toward Eunice, then back at the judge. For the first time since she'd entered, no one laughed. Marcus scribbled something in his notebook. "Stillness is a weapon if you know when to move." Eunice moved only once more that morning, to place her hands gently on the defense table, palms flat, as if she were steadying the room. No protest, no righteousness, only presence. And slowly, one by one, people in that courtroom realized she wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to make them reveal who they really were. And they were already doing it. All she had to do was wait. The courtroom had resumed its slow, mechanical rhythm. Papers shuffled, laptops clicked, and Judge Tate tapped his gavel once more, like it might remind the room who was in charge. But something had changed since Eunice Delacroix spoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't visible. But it was there, a shift in posture and breath in the way the jury glanced at her now, like they weren't entirely sure who they were looking at anymore. She had done so little, and yet everything felt heavier. Lacey Burrell returned to her argument, her voice clipped and polished. The defendant's refusal to comply created a disruption that required police response. Chain Lake PD acted in accordance with protocol, and the evidence will reflect that. She gestured again to the paused footage still hanging silently on the screen. No one looked at it the same way now. Eunice didn't interrupt. She simply turned her head slightly and looked not at Burrell, not at the jury, but at Officer Chavez, the youngest officer in the room. Maybe late 20s? Latino, his badge still a little too shiny, his uniform too neatly pressed. He met her gaze for a split second before looking away. Because he remembered. He had been there that morning. He hadn't been the one giving orders, but he had watched as Officer Jarrett stepped forward as hands were grabbed, as cuffs snapped around delicate wrists without warning. Eunice hadn't fought. She hadn't shouted. She had only asked one question, calmly, steadily, and the answer had been silence. Now she watched him again, not with accusation, but with expectation. Silence, Eunice had learned long ago, isn't always a lack of sound. It's an invitation, an opening. And if you hold it long enough, the truth often walks in uninvited. Years earlier, decades really, she had learned this in Montgomery, Alabama. 17, fresh out of high school, waiting at a bus stop with a scholarship acceptance letter tucked into her coat pocket. A white officer had pulled up in a patrol car, gotten out, and shouted at her for loitering. She hadn't moved because she hadn't understood. He hadn't asked a question, he'd issued a warning disguised as confusion. "You deaf girl, or just ignoring me." She had opened her mouth to explain, then stopped, not out of fear, but clarity. What she said didn't matter. His mind had been made up long before she arrived. That day, she had learned how quickly assumptions move faster than reason, faster than evidence, faster than truth. And so she stood still. That silence had cost her a night in holding a bruised shoulder, and a mother who would cry herself hoarse, arguing at the police station door. But it had also given her something that would stay with her for the next 6 decades, the understanding that words can be twisted, but silence makes others choose their own. Back in the courtroom, Officer Jarrett sat smugly behind the prosecutor's table, arms crossed. He leaned in toward Burrell and muttered something beneath his breath. Burrell didn't respond. Her jaw was clenched now. On the bench, Judge Tate seemed increasingly restless. He tapped the edge of his folder again and again, eyes darting toward Eunice, then away. His voice, when he spoke, lacked its usual authority. "Miss Delacroix," he said, "you'll have your turn to speak in due course. Please refrain from interjecting again." Eunice simply inclined her head. "Of course, Your Honor. No protest, no defense, just presence." It was that presence that rattled them more than any outburst ever could. She wasn't challenging the system. She was letting it reveal itself one twitch, one misstep, one overreaction at a time. Marcus Bell watched it unfold like a slow burn. He'd covered dozens of courtrooms across Michigan, from civil rights lawsuits to police brutality hearings. But this was different. Eunice hadn't given them anything to push against. That's what made them nervous. The court wasn't used to restraint. It was used to resistance, raised voices, angry gestures, desperate pleas. But not this. This was patience dressed in humility. This was strategy draped in age. The next witness was called a transit worker named Shelby Griggs, a white woman in her mid-40s who'd been near the bus terminal that day. Her testimony was brief and unrevealing. She hadn't seen the full encounter. Just a commotion, she said, and someone not cooperating. The words fell flat now, like someone trying to describe smoke after the fire had been revealed. Then it was Eunice's turn to cross-examine. She rose slowly, not from frailty, but from intention. She took 2 steps forward, hands clasped in front of her, and nodded gently to the witness. "Ms. Griggs," she began, "how many people were at the terminal that morning?" Griggs looked puzzled. Maybe a dozen." "And how many of them were asked to move by police?" Griggs hesitated. "I only saw the officers speaking to you. So to your knowledge, I was the only one given commands. The only one arrested." "Well, yes." Eunice nodded. "Thank you. That's all." She turned and walked back to the defense table, every step slow, unhurried, deliberate. It wasn't about proving her innocence, not yet. It was about proving that something here didn't add up. And the more she let the system speak, the more it said the wrong things. Marcus took a deep breath and typed a headline into his draft file. The court thought she was quiet. Turns out it was just loud enough. In the far corner, Officer Chavez swallowed hard. He looked at Jarrett, then at Burrell, then at Eunice. And in that silence, he realized maybe he hadn't spoken up that morning. Not because he didn't know what was happening, but because he did. And now, as Eunice returned to her seat and folded her hands gently on the table once again, she didn't need to look back at him, because silence, when held with enough care, becomes a mirror. And he had just seen his own face in it. For nearly 2 hours, the courtroom floated in a strange kind of tension, one that couldn't be named, but refused to release its grip. Eunice Delacroix had said less than 50 words all morning, yet the room pulsed around her as if she were conducting a silent symphony no one could explain. The prosecution pressed forward, tightening their grip on procedural language and carefully curated evidence. Officer Jarrett returned to the stand with the swagger of someone who still thought he owned the story. His version of events was clean, linear, emotionless. She failed to comply. She was unresponsive. I perceived her behavior as potentially threatening. It was all too familiar. Eunice didn't object. She didn't challenge the phrasing. She let him speak. Let him claim his comfort in front of a jury who now couldn't quite meet her gaze. But Marcus Bell, still watching from the gallery, knew this moment wasn't about refuting a lie. It was about waiting for the weight of that lie to collapse under its own arrogance. And then it began. It didn't start with drama. It began with a name. Near the back of the courtroom, a clerk from the Federal Oversight Office, young nervous tapping constantly at his laptop, slid his phone across the table toward one of the aides. A message had just come in from a DOJ server in D.C. The clerk read the subject line again, squinting, then leaned into the ear of the assistant. Within seconds, the tension in the air coiled tighter. It moved too fast for anyone to understand it at first. The assistant stood and exited the courtroom. A second aide made a call. No one in the gallery knew what was happening, but Marcus noticed it. The shift. The flutter of bureaucratic anxiety. The kind that only happens when someone realizes they've missed something very, very important. Back on the witness stand, Officer Jarrett continued speaking, unaware the ground was eroding beneath him. At that point, the defendant continued to ignore lawful commands. We were left with no alternative. Eunice slowly rose from her chair. "Officer," she said, voice soft, "when you approached me that morning, did you run my name through the system?" Jarrett blinked. "Yes." "And what did it return?" He paused. "Standard ID record. No warrants. Nothing notable." Eunice stepped forward, not dramatically, not aggressively, but with the quiet finality of someone who had waited decades to say what came next. "That's strange," she said. "Because my file isn't stored in the standard system." She turned to the judge, her hands still at her sides. "May I submit a request, Your Honor, for the court to issue a direct identification confirmation with the DOJ Office of Personnel Security?" Judge Tate frowned. "This is a local matter. That's beyond the scope of unless," Eunice said gently, "the defendant is not who you believe she is." That's when the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Two men entered, both in dark suits, badges clipped to their belts. One of them stepped forward, immediately carrying a sealed folder. He handed it to the clerk, then looked directly at Judge Tate. "My name is Agent Monroe, Internal Oversight, Department of Justice," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "Per order from Washington, we're here to confirm the identity of the defendant and to assume observation authority over these proceedings." The room gasped, but not Eunice. She remained motionless, calm. Judge Tate stammered, "This is highly irregular. Not when the individual in question," Monroe interrupted, "holds a federal clearance level that supersedes this court's jurisdiction." He turned to Eunice, nodded once. And in that moment, the quiet woman in the fraying blue dress, the old woman they had mocked, ignored, underestimated, stood taller without straightening her spine. Eunice Delacroix. Monroe continued, "is not a defendant. She is a senior intelligence operative attached to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division. Her presence here is part of an internal investigation into racial misconduct, systemic abuse of power, and due process violations in rural criminal courts." Jarrett's face drained of color. Burrell froze, mid-sentence, lips parted but silent. Tate's gavel slipped slightly in his hand. No one spoke. Marcus Bell could barely move his pen. His breath caught in his throat as he wrote, "She wasn't pretending to be someone else. We just never bothered to ask who she really was." Eunice turned now, not as a defendant, but as a mirror to every person in that room. "You didn't recognize my name," she said softly. "Not because I was hiding, but because you were never looking." She paused, scanning the jury, the officers, the judge. "I didn't come here to defend myself. I came to observe, to listen, to give you the space to show who you are when you believe no one is watching." Judge Tate, pale and rattled, tried to regain control. You manipulated this court." No Monroe cut in. She revealed it. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was simply devastating. Because in the silence that filled the room after that moment, everyone was left alone with their choices. With the laughter, the arrogance, the assumptions. The system didn't fail because of Eunice's silence. It failed because silence was the only thing it never knew how to interrogate. And now they had to answer to it. Not the woman they misnamed, not the old lady in cuffs, but the name no one bothered to know. Until it was far too late. For all the shock that had rippled through the courtroom after Eunice Delacroix's identity was revealed, what followed was not immediate collapse. It was denial, resistance, a stubborn clinging to the illusion of control. Judge Tate adjusted his robe with a deliberate calm, trying to reassert authority not through verdicts, but through posture. Lacey Burrell flipped through her papers as if still searching for a version of events that could erase the one now unfolding in front of her. But something fundamental had shifted, and not because of titles or badges, because nothing about Eunice's presence had changed. She still sat with the same weathered dignity, the same folded hands, the same gaze that seemed to see 2 steps beyond the moment. The only thing that had changed was what the room finally allowed itself to see. This wasn't a performance. Nothing was manufactured. Every chuckle, every condescending glance, every lazy assumption, they were real, raw, documented. And suddenly, the courtroom wasn't worried about what Eunice had done. It was terrified of what it had done in front of her. Agent Monroe remained at the edge of the room, clipboard in hand, not speaking unless spoken to. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. The seal on his folder, the silence in his stance, it all said what needed to be said. This was now federal. And that made what happened next all the more devastating. Eunice stood slow and steady and asked the court to play the officer body cam video again. The same clip they had already reviewed. Judge Tate, trying to recover a semblance of control, allowed it, perhaps thinking it would only confirm the facts already submitted into evidence. But when the video played this time, it did not begin with a muted command or a digital glitch. It began with full sound. Clear, untouched. Jarrett's voice could be heard aggressive and unprovoked. "I said, move along, ma'am. You don't get to just loiter wherever you want." Eunice didn't respond. The footage showed her standing, still arms at her side. No ID, no answer. "You're asking for it," Jarrett muttered. He approached quickly, too quickly, and then there it was. The sound of cuffs being drawn before a single word of resistance. The slam of metal against skin. The gritted voice of a man who wasn't restraining a threat, but asserting dominance. The courtroom was still as the footage ended. Eunice looked at Burrell, whose face had gone pale. "You submitted an edited video As your strongest piece of evidence, she said, not accusing, simply stating. You removed the sound. You controlled the narrative. Burl opened her mouth, but no words came. You didn't tamper with the video because you thought it would help your case, Eunice continued. You tampered with it because you knew what it sounded like, and you hoped no one would care enough to ask why it was silent. Judge Tate cleared his throat but didn't speak. Eunice turned back toward the jury. Nothing I experienced in this courtroom was staged. No script told Officer Jarrett to call me Bingo Lady. No memo instructed the prosecutor to smirk when I chose to speak for myself. No director told the judge to forget my name. You did that on your own. Because you believed no one important was watching. It wasn't said with fury. It was said with something far heavier disappointment. This isn't theater, she said, but you performed anyway. Her voice remained low, but there was an edge now. A razor buried in velvet. When I stood silent, you called me uncooperative. When I asked for evidence, you called me difficult. And when I quoted the law, you swore to uphold. You questioned my sanity. At the prosecution table, Burl stood abruptly. Objection. This is not an appropriate line of overruled, Judge Tate muttered. His voice cracked at the end. The jury sat frozen. One man gripped his seat like it might hold him together. A woman to his left blinked hard and fast, like the tears were building, and she wasn't ready to let them fall. What they had just seen, what they had heard, it couldn't be unheard. They had watched a woman be arrested for standing still, and now they were being forced to admit they'd believed the edited version first. Eunice walked back to her seat, but she didn't sit. She turned to face the gallery. You laughed, she said, eyes scanning the rows of spectators. Not all of you, but some. You laughed when you thought this would be easy, when you thought this was about an old woman who didn't know better. She paused, a breath. I knew exactly what this courtroom would do. Because I've spent a lifetime watching what happens when a black woman speaks, calmly stands tall, and refuses to apologize for existing. And then she turned to face Judge Tate. You told me this wasn't a lecture hall, but you ran it like a stage. You thought I was putting on a show. You never imagined I was watching yours. Silence. Even Agent Monroe, composed and professional, lowered his clipboard. Marcus Bell, still seated in the gallery, scribbled one line into his notebook. All caps. Everything they did was real. That's why it hurts. Eunice sat down slowly. No flourish, no grandstanding. But no one in that room would ever again be able to call her the defendant without shame catching in their throat. Because the trial hadn't been about proving a crime. It had been about proving a pattern. And all she had to do was let them be exactly who they were. No edits, no staging, just truth. And the silence that finally made them hear it. The gavel never came down again. After Eunice Delacroix sat back in her chair, a stillness consumed the courtroom, not the kind that demanded order, but the kind that marked surrender. No one stood. No one moved. Judge Tate looked down at his bench, like a man seeing it for the first time, and realizing it was never his throne. Lacey Burrell had gone motionless. At the prosecution table, her jaw clenched, not from defiance, but from recognition. She had lost something more than a case. She had lost the privilege of not knowing. Agent Monroe stepped forward without flourish, placing a folder on the clerk's desk with the calm precision of a man who didn't need to prove he belonged. He read the final lines from a federal statement. The Department of Justice was officially opening a full investigation into Chain Lake's judicial practices, including a review of all recent court cases overseen by Judge Tate. Every arrest conducted by officers Jarrett Campos and Deegan would be audited under federal oversight. Title 18. Section 242 would be applied, and accountability would no longer be theoretical. Officer Jarrett sat as if shackled to the seat beneath him, eyes flicking toward the door, but knowing it led nowhere. Behind him, Officer Chavez stared down at his own hands, as if realizing too late that silence could either shield you or indict you. It was never neutral. When the marshals arrived to escort Jarrett and Campos out of the courtroom, there were no cuffs yet, but the weight of what waited beyond the courthouse steps was visible in every inch of their posture. What Eunice had done wasn't about punishment. It was about exposure. And there's a different kind of justice that happens when people are made to face themselves in public. Marcus Bell, still scribbling in the gallery, didn't know what to title his story. Every draft line he'd considered, the woman who waited, the courtroom that collapsed, the silence that spoke now felt too small. He looked up at Eunice and realized this wasn't about what she said or even what she revealed. It was about what she made possible. A woman who walked into a courtroom in an orange jumpsuit had become the measure by which they would now judge themselves. Judge Tate finally spoke, but his voice was thinner now. Ms. Delacroix, do you have anything else to add before we recess? She stood, slowly turned, not toward him, but toward the jury, toward the people who had been watching her, evaluating her, waiting for her to break a rule or a tone or a code. I'm not here to tell you what justice should look like, she said, her voice steady. I'm here to ask if what you saw today looked anything like it. She looked from one juror to the next, not accusing, not pleading. Justice isn't how loudly you defend the law, she continued. It's how carefully you listen when it's being misused. And it's what you do when no one's supposed to be watching. She paused. Let the silence fill the room again. I didn't speak because I wanted to see what this court did when it believed I couldn't fight back. That's the kind of justice we rarely get to measure what happens when someone's presumed powerless. She turned back to Judge Tate. I never raised my voice, Your Honor. And yet the whole courtroom flinched. She sat down again the way she always did, gently, quietly, deliberately. Outside, word had already begun to spread. The hallway was full of reporters, some who had never cared much for local trials, but now found themselves racing for space. Federal vehicles lined the curb. And across state lines, phones buzzed with forwarded clips, headline screenshots, fragments of audio from inside the courtroom. By the time the DOJ held their official press conference 2 days later, the clip of Eunice saying, "Silence isn't surrender, it's surveillance," had already gone viral. But Eunice didn't attend the press conference. She didn't issue a personal statement. She didn't take interviews. Instead, she visited an elementary school on the west side of Chicago, her old neighborhood. She stood at a microphone in a library filled with fourth graders and said only this: "When someone tells you quiet people have nothing to say, don't believe them. Quiet people are listening. And one day, they'll ask the question that changes everything." A teacher in the back wiped her eyes without making a sound. A boy in the front row stared like he was seeing a superhero in real life. Later that night, Marcus Bell finished his story. He didn't frame Eunice as a savior. He didn't dramatize the courtroom collapse. He wrote it exactly as it was, a system that exposed itself in the presence of someone who refused to mirror its rage. His article ended with a single line. Justice doesn't always arrive with a siren. It sometimes walks in old shoes, sits still, and listens until the room convicts itself. Eunice Delacroix returned to her home later that week, small, quiet, nothing extraordinary from the outside. But people in her neighborhood stopped her differently now. Not with fanfare, not with awe, but with something simpler reverence. Not because she had toppled a courthouse, but because she had done it without raising her voice. One evening, a teenage girl from the block knocked on her door with a school assignment in her hand. "Ms. Delacroix?" she asked shyly. "Is it true they thought you were just a regular old lady?" Eunice smiled, not proud, but knowing. "No, sweetheart," she said. "They thought I was invisible." That's not the same thing. The girl didn't understand fully, but she nodded anyway. And Eunice let the moment be, because she knew now what mattered. She hadn't dismantled a courtroom with evidence or rhetoric. She had simply refused to play a part in its theater. She had let it play itself and watched. Justice, she realized, was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be seen when it thought no one was looking. And now, finally, someone was. Eunice Delacroix walked into a courtroom in cuffs, wrapped in assumptions underestimated by nearly everyone who saw her. To them, she was just another elderly black woman, silent, solitary, fragile. But beneath her quiet demeanor was a mind that had spent decades observing systems built to ignore people like her. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She waited. She waited as judges mocked her officers, disrespected her, and lawyers dismissed her. And when they revealed who they truly were, when they exposed their biases without knowing she was watching, she revealed herself not as a defendant, but as a senior federal investigator. What followed wasn't just justice, it was revelation. A corrupted courtroom dismantled itself, not through outrage, but through the power of silence used with purpose. Eunice proved that dignity doesn't have to roar, and truth doesn't always need a microphone. She shifted the balance of power not by demanding it, but by being unshakable in the face of injustice. She didn't fight the system with noise. She let the system indict itself, and when it did, the entire nation was forced to listen. This wasn't just a story about a woman being wronged. It was a story about a country that too often assumes silence means weakness. But Eunice reminded us silence can be strategy. Patience can be protest, and stillness, when held with wisdom, can become one of the most powerful weapons we have. The lesson here is profound. In a world that demands we speak constantly to prove our worth, sometimes the most radical act is to wait, to observe, to choose the moment that matters. Eunice's story teaches us to listen more carefully, to watch more intentionally, and to never underestimate someone simply because they choose not to shout. So if this story stirred something in you, if it made you reflect, rethink, or even just feel, then help us continue to tell the stories that matter. Stories that don't just entertain, but expose. Stories that remind us of the quiet heroes walking among us every day. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video, because justice doesn't always wear a badge, but it always deserves to be heard.